What's up, everybody? This is Passion 9. Welcome back to the Passion 9 podcast. Today, I want to talk about the latest Resident Evil game, Resident Evil Village. Now, I completed this game in about, 9 hours and 44 minutes on my first playthrough. I've played all the Resident Evil games, loved the franchise, and was super excited for this one. And now that I have, let's break it down. Let's talk about some Resident Evil Village. Now, I will be spoiling this game. There will be spoilers galore, so if you haven't played it yet, I suggest you do. Now then, as for how this game fares uh, in the franchise, it's a little sloppy. It's a little uneven. I will admit this game has some issues. I do think it's a little sloppy. It's a little clunky, it's a little junky, and we'll get to all that. First off, takes a lot of cues from 7. It is set after 7. It does borrow a lot of cues from that one. Much like 7, I think it opens up a little slow. I think the opening section where you're walking around in the woods in the dark. Well, first there's moving around Ethan's house, putting the baby to bed, and then you've got the woods where you're scrounging around in the dark. Then you get to the village, you fight off some werewolves, you meet a bunch of survivors at the house in the village. And all of that opening section there is a little slow. It's a little scripted, a little too linear. I would argue this is a problem I had with 7 as well. This is a problem I had with 7, where there's a little too much linearity and scripted sequences in these games. And again, it does take a lot of cues from 7. I do think the opening section is a little slow, especially on repeat playthroughs. Now, it is super effective the first time you play, but I think the problem with opening your game that way is that it's going to be the same every time. And it's such a scripted linear sequence of events that it feels like you're on, I don't know, an amusement park ride or something, like you're on an attraction or something. Where it's going to be the same each time. And each time you replay, you're going to get that same experience. And, to me, this is something Resident Evil 2 Remake actually avoids. It had an opening section that gets you right into it, right into the gameplay, right into the open-ended exploration and item hunting and all that. And this is something I think that Village and 7 kind of lack. There's a little too much slag in the beginning. There's a little too much time spent showing this off or showing that off. And, you've got your gotcha moments, your little scares, but they only really work on the first playthrough. I feel like I could play Remake 2 over and over and still jump or still get scared just because of the game's dynamic systems. And that's not to say Village doesn't get there. I would say once you get to the castle, once you get to Demetres Castle, then it starts to open up, and then it starts to feel like a proper Resident Evil game with the exploration, key hunting, and, atmosphere and all that. But leading up to that, it's a little slow. I did have some problems there, and once I got to the castle, it was great. Like, maybe not that scary. A lot of this game isn't scary. That is something I will say, except for one section later on that we'll get to that qualifies as one of the best horror bits in any Resident Evil game ever made. But we'll get there. I would say the castle is great because it's an open-ended exploration area, kind of like the police station in RE2 or the mansion. It feels open-ended. I love how they designed it because it feels like you're in a real castle. It feels like the way it's laid out, the way it's structured, it feels like you're in a real place. Like you're in a castle that you could actually live in. It's not like the Resident Evil 4 castle where it's like, it's a little more video gamey, it's a little more level design sort of centric. No, there's something about the castle in this game that does feel like a real open-ended location, like a real layout. It feels like you could live in this castle. Um, and that's great. It's great for exploration. It's a beautiful looking area. It's one of the most beautiful looking environments I've seen in any game lately. So exploring it is a lot of fun. Again, I wouldn't say it's that scary though. It's kind of light on combat. So you're mostly just hunting down items and solving puzzles. Even the daughters of Demetresque, um, that follow you around the castle as bugs or whatever. They're pretty easy to kill, and they don't take that long to kill either. I was surprised at how easily they went down. And even Lady Demetresque herself, once she starts chasing you around like Mr. X, it's kind of a letdown, honestly. It's not that hard. It's not that challenging. You can kind of run past her pretty easily. You can run around her. It's not that complex of a section. And so that would be my only issue there, is that it's not that scary and it's not that hard to do. And in fact, on a second playthrough, I was surprised at how quick the castle was beaten. I was surprised how quickly I was able to move through it. It just felt pretty easy overall. And again, this is a problem that Resident Evil Village does suffer from. It does suffer from being a little too easy. That's something the game does have a bit of a problem with. And again, it takes a lot of cues from 7, but it also takes a lot of cues from Resident Evil 4. You have a merchant again. In fact, the Duke, the merchant named the Duke, is a great character. I like that guy. They brought back the merchant, but he's actually more involved in the story this time around. He's more a part of the plot, which is cool. And you can upgrade your weapons. You can buy new guns, buy ammo, sell stuff. It's very RE4 in that sense. But one of the problems with this game is that it doesn't necessarily, it's got a little bit of 7 and it's got a little bit of 4, but it doesn't quite commit to either of those. It doesn't commit to being as consistently creepy as Resident Evil 7, and it doesn't commit to being as consistently action focused as Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 developed its action over the whole course of the game. And Resident Evil 7 slowly developed its horror as well. So I feel like by trying to do both, it leads to a pretty uneven game overall. It's a little messy. For example, after the castle, you get to what I would consider to be like one of the best horror sections in any Resident Evil I've ever played. The dollhouse is incredible. Like one of the scariest places in any Resident Evil game I've played. That baby monster that follows you down the freaking hallway is nightmare fuel. That's like straight out of a Silent Hill game. Because honestly, I've never found Resident Evil that scary in general. I would say like the first one and I guess Resident Evil 2 were pretty scary. But most of the games in the series really didn't scare me that much. So when I got to this bit, when I got to Donna Beneviento's house, terrifying. One of the scariest nights I've had with any game in ages. It's probably been like 15 years since a game scared me that much. Long ass time, because I haven't experienced anything like that in like a while. And it had me jumping, it had me nervous. Could barely hold the controller. Everything in that section, from the puzzles to the slow creeping atmosphere to that chase from the baby monster, is brilliant. It's masterful. Like, it is a textbook example of how you do horror in a video game. The fact that I didn't want to turn around and look at this thing, the sound design was good enough. The sound design was enough to scare the crap out of me and make me run. I didn't even want to turn around and look at this thing. That's when you know you've got good horror. That's when you know you're experiencing real, like, atmosphere there. So that section was brilliant. Scary as hell, but again, it also dials back completely on the combat. There's not that much combat in the castle. There's not a lot of combat at all in the dollhouse section. There's like zero combat there. So the game drops its combat quite a bit, which is strange for a Resident Evil game that is trying to take a lot of cues from 4 as well. Like, again, you have that weapon merchant you can go to, but so much of the game has long stretches with no combat at all. So there's not much time for the combat to develop, and by the time it does crank up the combat again, well, first I will say the fish monster section is okay. That was pretty good. Not as good as the dollhouse, because that is the peak of the game. Honestly, I feel like that's the best section of the game. That's the creepiest, most awesome section. And then it kind of starts to peter out a bit. The fish guy I liked. It was okay. It's an okay uh, chase section. But by the time you get to the factory, the Heisenberg factory, that's where the game starts to get a little dull. But before that, I will say this. I will say the game has great villains. I love the Four Lords. That scene where we're introduced to them all is like it's like something straight out of Metal Gear Solid. The fact that they're all gathered around, they bicker with each other and argue, and they're all like these weird, crazy personalities. You know, you got this vampire woman, Dimitrescu. You got Donna Beneviento and her creepy dolls. You got this fish dude, and you've got Heisenberg. I like Heisenberg. I like his dialogue. I like how uh, sort of charismatic he is in this game. Everybody was building up and hyping up Dimitrescu as like the big villain in this game, but they all actually get pretty equal screen time. It's really not centered on her. And I would say that's more of an internet thing where they all latched on to this one character, but it's like they didn't heavily market or advertise the rest of them, which is good because they are more surprising when you get to them as a result of that. Um, there's a lot in this game that wasn't advertised or spoiled, honestly. It's just a shame that some of it didn't turn out to be that good anyway. Like I said, Heisenberg, I like him as a personality, but he is a strange villain. He is a little out of place compared to the other villains in the game. Like all these other characters have like this gothic old school monster movie thing going on, this old horror thing going on. But he's like his whole thing is he controls metal. Like, okay, I like the character, I like his personality, but why is he Magneto? Why does he control metal? That seems out of place for a Resident Evil game. Like, I know past villains have been pretty over the top. Like, Wesker, by the time you get to Code Veronica, was practically Neo from the Matrix. I get it, but it's also like such an oddly specific power to have. He just controls metal. Okay, and his whole area, his whole level, the factory area is kind of boring. It's not that much fun. Like you had all these beautiful gothic environments before leading up to this, and you get to his factory and it's kind of dull. It's just this industrial facility and there are these guys, these like I guess they're almost like Frankenstein monsters, these guys with their drill arms or whatever. And maybe that's what they were going for, but the environment feels kind of dull. The enemies are not that much fun to fight. And yeah, Heisenberg, he's a fun personality as a villain, but like, why does he have? We never get a satisfactory explanation as to why he can control metal. It's just kind of a weird, random power for him to have. And the boss fight of this area, the game generally has good bosses. It does have fun boss fights. They're not like super complex or anything, but they are fun. They are meaty bosses. I would say the fight with Heisenberg though is like one of the most out of place things I've ever seen in a Resident Evil game ever. It's like you're fighting this giant metal monster guy and you're in this tank with a chainsaw and a minigun attached to it, and it's like, what? When did this turn into life-size battle bots? It's just kind of weird. It's kind of out of place for a Resident Evil game, especially this one. Because again, leading up to all that, it does have this really beautiful, uh, almost Brothers Grimm like gothic horror thing going on. And I thought that was going to be maintained through the whole game. I thought that was going to be like what they were going for aesthetically. And when you get to this factory area, it just kind of ruins all that, kind of derails it. I guess it's supposed to be like the lab, the sort of token lab area of this Resident Evil game, because there's always a lab. There's always a laboratory or something. But it feels too plain. It feels like they went for a very modern industrial thing. I would have preferred, like, I don't know, like a Frankenstein's lab sort of environment. You know, it's like you got this gothic village with a big castle and all this stuff. Might as well have like an old school laboratory where it's got all this crazy these crazy bulbs and strap beds and all this stuff. Like that would have been way cooler to me. It would have fit the theme of the game better. And I don't know, maybe Heisenberg could have been more of a by like a cyborgian Dr. Frankenstein or something. I don't know. The where they went with him and where they went with his area just felt really off. Felt really off with the rest of the game. And that is where things kind of peter off. Because, like I said, a lot of the stuff leading up to that is great. It's pretty good. It's not very scary outside of that dollhouse section, but it's pretty fun. It's pretty good. And then you get to this factory, and it was like, yeah, I wasn't enjoying that as much. It was kind of dull because here's the problem. It doesn't. You get to a point in the game where it's not. It doesn't have the snappy, tight action of like Resident Evil 4. You know, it doesn't quite reach the heights of a Resident Evil 4 action section, but it's also not scary. It's just not that scary either. So when you don't have either of those, it just falls into this kind of bland middle ground where it's not that scary and it's not that action heavy. So what do you got left, you know? The section following that, you play as Chris Redfield and it practically turns into Call of Duty, which, don't get me wrong, was more fun than the factory section because at least you're just running and gunning and it turns into a bit of an action game, but it's still kind of out of place too because, yeah, it practically turns into Call of Duty. It really does just straight up, it turns into a Call of Duty game. To the point where you have like laser or airstrikes or whatever that you can call down during the gameplay with its own cooldown and everything, and it's like, okay, yep, we're doing this. We're doing COD in Resident Evil, and you know it was all right. It's not a very long section, and again, after that bland, kind of boring factory area, I welcomed it. But after that, you have the final boss, and the game ends, and it's just like, yeah, there really wasn't anything to pick it up again once you get to that factory section. So that was a disappointment to me. It feels like a lot of the first half of the game, the first 75% or so, is really, really good. Then you get to this part of the game, this last quarter, and it's like, ugh, what the hell happened? What the hell happened to my Resident Evil? Why did it turn into a Michael Bay film? You know, like, it just gets a little lost in all the crazy, weird action stuff. And again, Resident Evil 4 kind of did that too, but Resident Evil 4 also developed its action better over the course of the game. And this one doesn't quite do that. Now, that also brings me to the storyline, which I will say, unabashedly, is absolute dog shit. Yes, I like the villains. I like that they brought back Ethan Winters or whatever. But here's the thing. The main hook of this game's story, when they showed the first trailer and all that, was that Chris Redfield was potentially a villain. He was potentially becoming the bad guy. And at first I thought, okay, that's a hell of a hook. That's cool. That's something that I want to know more about. Like, what made him go bad? Busts into Ethan's house, kills his wife, steals his daughter. It's like, okay, what's up with that? Like, what drove Chris to become this monster. And you think it's going to be an interesting reveal. You think it's going to be an interesting story point. But then we get to the reveal, and you find out, oh, that wasn't his wife. That was the main villain of the game, pretending to be his wife. Disguised as his wife. Uh, and all Chris Redfield had to do at the start of this game was say, "That's not your wife. That's a monster. That's a freaking monster. I'm here to save you and your daughter." That's all he had to say. It's horrible writing because we get that moment, where he puts a gun to Ethan's face, knocks him out, and all he had to do was tell him what's going on. And apparently, the big explanation for this is, I didn't want to get you involved. I didn't want to get civilians involved. So you withhold crucial information? I mean, it just makes Chris seem like a dick, honestly. It just makes him seem like a terrible person. It makes him seem villainous anyway, because it's like, why would you withhold this information? You bust into a man's home, you seemingly kill his wife, and you don't tell him why? Like, if you weren't really doing that, maybe you should say something. He had time. It's not like he didn't have time. The game's whole excuse is he was in a hurry, he had to move quick, didn't have time to explain it. I hate when stories do that. It's bad writing. And look, I'm not saying the Resident Evil franchise is well known for great storytelling. I'm not saying that it's like a series known for its writing, but goddamn, man, Resident Evil 2, at least in that game, it was like, hey, evil corporation leaked a deadly virus, zombies happen. Simple story, you got what you need there. With this one, it's like, not only is the story like badly written, it's convoluted. It's really convoluted. The big reveal about like why there's werewolves, why all the villains have their powers, and what happened to the village is horrible. It's so convoluted, it's so messy, it doesn't feel adequately or satisfyingly explained. And the game just throws so much at you at the end. There's so much being revealed. About the only reveal or twist that I thought was kind of interesting was finding out that Ethan was actually dead since Resident Evil 7. That he actually died in the events of that game and has been like sort of undead the whole time. Kind of an interesting twist. It's still kind of sloppily done. I still think even that reveal could have been better executed, but they were going for something there. And it feels a little poignant, the way it ties in with 7. But overall, I did not care for the plot of this game. The plot was not good. Like, moment to moment, when you're dealing with the villains and you don't know what's going on yet, it's fine. But by the time we get to the ultimate baddie, Mother Miranda, by the time we get to her story and we find out what she was all about, it's just ridiculous. It's just terrible. It's not a good storyline. Capcom should really do better. They should really just hire better writers. Because even 7, I thought, had some plot holes and the story was a little rough. But at least by the end of that game, you sort of felt like, okay, this toxic mold stuff got into their brains and that's what's going on. Again, the explanation for the werewolves and all of that stuff does not feel satisfyingly explained. Like, it's not a good reveal. So that stuff was pretty weak. I would argue, okay, it's not as bad a story as Resident Evil 6. Certainly not as bad as that. It's a sloppy, uneven game in a lot of respects, but it's certainly not that game. I would still say it's good. I would still say Village is good. It looks great. It plays pretty well. And again, the early sections are really fun, and I enjoyed them a lot. I would just say the last quarter of the game, both in its story, in its environments, just kind of falls apart a little bit. It kind of loses its way, and I feel like Resident Evil 4 was a better action game, and Resident Evil 2 Remake was a better horror game. So, even though there are times where, the action hits a high peak or the horror hits a high peak, I feel like they're never really evenly divided out throughout the game. It's a little too messy and uneven. But what's there is really good. What works really well in the game is good stuff. I would still say it's worth checking out, but I do think Capcom has done better. I don't think this is the best Resident Evil game by any stretch. It's far from the worst. I would still say Resident Evil 6, 5, Resident Evil 0. I would say those are worse than this game. It's still more engaging than those. It's more engaging than those, and it's a better package overall. You do get some cool extras like New Game Plus and the Mercenaries Mode. I will admit, Mercenaries did feel a little. I was excited about it at first. It is a little drier to me in this game because it's all first person. It's not that over the shoulder, snappy gameplay from 4. So Mercenaries Mode, it's still a cool mode, but I feel like it's not as good in this game. I don't know, like, and that brings me to that actually, the first person perspective thing. It's kind of hard because there are sections of this game where I feel like it works really well. It does create a lot of immersion. It does absorb you into the game more in some respects. But I also think when it comes to action, I just prefer over the shoulder. I think Capcom has justified that since 4. And with Resident Evil 2 Remake especially, I felt like, yeah, keep it over the shoulder. Keep it like I like this third person thing better because it just like it kind of gets the best of both worlds. The camera's still close to you, but you can still see your character. And I mean that didn't take away from the horror of 2. You know what I mean? Like part of me really wanted this to be over the shoulder rather than first person because there are limitations to first person perspectives in games. It can limit the storytelling a little bit because everything's got to be from your POV. During combat, it can make things uncomfortable because you can't see around your character. So, I feel like that can cheapen the gameplay a little bit, especially the combat heavy sections where you're being chased and you're running around and you can't see very much. Your field of view is a little limited. Um, so I don't know. Part of me is kind of hoping that with whatever they do with Resident Evil 9, I'm kind of hoping they maybe go back to the over the shoulder stuff. Just saying. Because I don't know. I don't know how I feel about keeping Resident Evil in first person. I don't know if I want that. But yeah, I guess we'll see what Capcom has in store. But yeah, overall, I really enjoyed Resident Evil Village. Despite its faults, I do think it has some faults. I do think there's a better game in there somewhere. There's a better game. I would say it's good. It's not quite great. If I had to give it a number, I'd be like maybe a 7 out of 10. Maybe. I think that the potential was there for this to be a great game all the way through. And instead, it just kind of misses the mark. It doesn't stick the landing as well as it could have. And that is a little disappointing. But overall, a good game. A good Resident Evil game. Sometimes, even though very briefly, a good horror game as well. So, yeah. Resident Evil Village. 7 out of 10. Uh, if you're a Resident Evil fan, I say check it out. It's pretty good. not as replayable as Resident Evil 2 Remake, and not as good of an action game as 4. So it's a little bit of all of those. There's a little bit of everything. There's a little bit of the whole franchise in this game, but it doesn't quite commit to any of the strengths through the whole thing. So that's all I've got to say about Resident Evil Village. Thank you guys for tuning in once more, and as always, live for the passion. Goodbye.